Hello, and welcome to Lanternlight Chronicles. Tonight, let the day come quietly to its close. Let the cares of it loosen and slip away, one by one, like a boat drifting from its moorings out onto still water. Let your shoulders soften. Let your breathing slow and deepen. And let me carry you a very long way from here, across the sea, and across more than 2,000 years of time, to a shining white city on the coast of Egypt, where the greatest gathering of knowledge that the ancient world ever knew once stood beside the harbor, and where a mystery still lingers, quiet and unsolved, over the question of how it came to be lost. Picture it now, in the soft light of an early morning long ago. You are walking through a great colonnade of pale stone, its columns rising on either side of you toward a high ceiling, the cool morning air moving gently through the open arches. Beyond the columns, through the arches, you can see the blue of the Mediterranean, calm and bright, and hear the faint cries of gulls and the murmur of the waking city. But here, within these walls, there is a deeper hush, the particular quiet of a place given over to thought. And all around you, in room after room, on shelf after shelf, in great honeycombs of wooden pigeonholes reaching up the walls, lie the scrolls, hundreds of them, thousands of them, tens upon tens of thousands of them, each one a roll of pale papyrus wound upon a wooden rod, each one tagged with a little hanging label, each one holding the words of some human mind reaching out across time. Here, gathered into this one place, is very nearly the whole of what the ancient world knew. The poems of Homer, copied and studied and compared, the plays of the great dramatists, the histories of distant lands, the treatises of the philosophers and the geometers and the physicians, books of astronomy that map the wandering stars, books of medicine that describe the workings of the human body, books of geography, of mathematics, of music, of law, of myth, gathered from every corner of the known world, from Greece and Egypt and Persia and Babylon and beyond, and brought here, to this city by the sea, to be kept and copied and read. A scholar sits at a table in a shaft of morning light, an unrolled scroll before him, moving his lips softly as he reads, and behind him stretch the endless shelves, and above him the pale stone, and beyond the columns the bright and patient sea. This is the Great Library of Alexandria, at the very height of its glory. And one day, all of this will be gone. Tonight, we are going to ask what happened to it. It is one of the most famous mysteries in all of history, and one of the most misunderstood. For almost everyone has heard the story, or some version of it, that the Great Library of Alexandria, the wonder of the ancient world, was destroyed in a single catastrophic fire, its countless scrolls consumed in one terrible night. All that priceless knowledge lost forever in a few hours of flame. It is a story that has haunted the imagination for centuries, a symbol of everything precious that can be lost in a moment of violence and folly. But the true story, the real story of what happened to the Great Library, is stranger and slower, and in its own way, far sadder than that. For the truth, as best we can piece it together, is that the library did not die in a single night at all. It died slowly, over centuries, by 100 small wounds and quiet neglects, so gradually that no one can say for certain when the last scroll crumbled to dust, or who was there to see it go. Tonight we will follow that long, slow story from its beginning to its end. We will watch the city of Alexandria rise from bare ground at the command of a conqueror. We will meet the kings who dreamed of gathering all the books in the world into a single place, and see the cunning and even ruthless ways they went about it. We will walk among the great minds who worked here, the men and women who measured the size of the earth, who mapped the stars, who studied the human body, who preserved the poems of Homer, in this one extraordinary place where the knowledge of the ancient world was gathered as it had never been gathered before or since. And then we will trace the long twilight of the library, the fires and the sackings and the slow fading, and we will try, as honestly as we can, to answer the question that has echoed down the ages. What really happened to the Great Library of Alexandria? There is nothing you need to remember. There will be no test in the morning, and nothing here you must carry with you. If your thoughts begin to drift and wander, let them drift. If sleep comes for you before we reach the end of the story, then let it come, and welcome, for that is exactly what this quiet hour is for. The scrolls will still be waiting in the dark, and I will still be here, telling their long story softly, whether you hear the end of it tonight or not. And if you find that these calm histories help to carry you down toward rest, you might gently tap the like button, and perhaps subscribe, so that more of them can find their way to you, and to others who lie awake in the dark, and are looking for something quiet to hold on to. That is the only thing I will ask of you all evening. And now let the modern world dissolve entirely, and let us go back across the centuries, to a stretch of empty shore on the coast of Egypt, and to the day a conqueror stood upon it and dreamed of a city. The city was born of a conqueror's dream. More than 300 years before the birth of Christ, a young king of Macedon named Alexander swept out of Greece at the head of his armies and set about conquering the whole of the known world, and in a few short years he did very nearly that, overthrowing the mighty empire of Persia and carving out a dominion that stretched from Greece to the borders of India. In the course of these campaigns he came into Egypt, that ancient land of the Nile, older by far than Greece itself, and the Egyptians, weary of their Persian overlords, received him not as an invader, but as a liberator. And there, on the coast of Egypt, at a place where a narrow strip of land ran between the sea and a broad inland lake, Alexander saw the perfect site for a great city. A city that would face out across the Mediterranean toward Greece. A harbor city, a meeting place of worlds. He marked out its boundaries himself, so the story goes, and gave it his own name, and then he marched away east to his further conquests and never saw it again. He would be dead within a few years, still a young man, his vast empire left without an heir. But the city he had founded would outlast him by more than 1,000 years, and would become, for a time, the most brilliant city in the world. It was called, after him, Alexandria. When Alexander died, far away in Babylon, his generals fell to quarreling over the pieces of his empire, and after long wars, they divided it among themselves, each taking a kingdom. Egypt, that richest and most ancient of prizes, fell to one of the ablest of these generals, a shrewd and capable man named Ptolemy, who made himself king of Egypt and founded a dynasty that would rule the land for nearly 300 years, down to its very last and most famous queen, Cleopatra. Ptolemy and his descendants made Alexandria their capital, and they poured into it the immense wealth of Egypt, the gold and the grain of the Nile Valley, and they set about making it a city worthy of the conqueror whose name it bore. Under the Ptolemies, Alexandria grew with astonishing speed into a vast and glittering metropolis, one of the largest cities in the world, its streets laid out in a great grid, its harbor crowded with the shipping of every nation, its skyline crowned with palaces and temples, and at the mouth of its harbor, one of the wonders of the ancient world. A towering lighthouse of white stone, whose fire guided ships in from far out at sea. But the Ptolemies wanted more than wealth and splendor. They were Greeks, ruling over an ancient and foreign land, and they wished to make their new capital not only the richest city in the world, but its greatest center of learning and culture, a new Athens, a place that would draw to itself the finest minds of the age and outshine even the old cities of Greece in the brilliance of its thought. And so the first Ptolemy, and even more his son, the second Ptolemy, conceived an idea of breathtaking ambition, an idea that would make their city immortal. They would build, in Alexandria, a home for the learning of the whole world. They would gather to their court the greatest scholars, the finest poets, the sharpest philosophers and mathematicians and astronomers and physicians of the age. And they would give them everything they needed to pursue their work, freed from every worldly care. And to support that community of scholars, they would build a library, and not merely a library, but the library, a collection that would hold, if it could be done, every book that had ever been written, the entire accumulated knowledge of humankind, gathered into a single place. At the heart of this dream stood an institution they called the museum, though we must be careful with that word, for it did not mean then what it means to us now. The Museum of Alexandria was not a hall of display for the curious public. Its name meant, quite literally, a place of the muses, the 9 goddesses who in Greek belief presided over poetry and music and history and astronomy and all the arts and sciences, and it was, in effect, a great research institution, the first of its kind in the world, a community of scholars living and working together under the patronage of the king. Here the learned men of the age were given lodging and meals and salaries, all provided by the crown, so that they might devote themselves entirely to study. They dined together in a great common hall. They walked and talked together in covered colonnades and shaded gardens. They had lecture halls and workrooms and, some say, an observatory for watching the stars and rooms for the dissection of bodies. It was, in the fullest sense, a university and an academy of sciences, gathered around the person of the king, hundreds of years before any such thing would exist anywhere else in the world. And the beating heart of the museum, the treasure that made all its work possible, was the library. For a scholar can do nothing without books, and the whole purpose of the library was to place at the disposal of the museum's scholars the accumulated writing of the entire world. The Ptolemies meant to leave nothing out. They wanted the poems and the plays of the Greeks, of course, in the best and most accurate copies that could be found. But they wanted also the writings of the Egyptians, translated from their ancient tongue, and the writings of the Babylonians, the astronomical records kept for centuries in the temples of the East, and the sacred books of the Jews, and the wisdom of the Persians, and the knowledge of every people the Greeks had ever encountered. They dreamed of a universal library, a single place that would hold the whole of human knowledge, and they pursued that dream with a determination, and sometimes a ruthlessness, that is astonishing to contemplate even now. The ways in which the Ptolemies gathered their books were as bold and as cunning as the dream itself, and some of the stories that came down about them are worth telling. For they show just how far these kings were willing to go to fill their shelves. The simplest method was to buy, and the Ptolemies sent agents out across the whole Greek world with heavy purses, to the great book markets of Athens and Rhodes and the cities of the East, with orders to purchase every worthwhile scroll they could find, at whatever price. Money was no object. The wealth of Egypt stood behind them, and they spent it freely, buying up entire private collections, the accumulated libraries of dead philosophers and scholars, and shipping them home to Alexandria by the cartload. But buying was only the beginning. There is a famous story that the Ptolemies made a standing order, that any ship which put in at the harbor of Alexandria, no matter where it came from or where it was bound, must surrender any books found aboard it. The scrolls would be carried off to the library, where the scribes would make a careful copy of each one, and then, so the story goes, the library would keep the original and give the owner back the copy, along with some payment for his trouble. The original, the authentic old scroll, went onto the shelves of Alexandria. The traveler sailed away with a fresh copy in its place. Whether or not it happened in exactly this way, the collection at Alexandria came to include a special category of scrolls known as the books from the ships, gathered in from the traffic of the harbor, and the tale captures perfectly the hunger of these kings for the written word, a hunger so great that they would strip the very cargoes of passing vessels to feed it. The most famous of all these stories concerns the city of Athens, and the official texts of the great Athenian tragedies. The plays of the 3 greatest Athenian dramatists were treasured beyond price, and the city of Athens kept official master copies of them in its public archive, the authoritative texts against which all performances were to be judged. The Ptolemy of the day desperately wished to have these master copies for his library, and so he asked to borrow them, in order, he said, to make careful copies for Alexandria. The Athenians were reluctant to let such treasures out of their city, and they agreed only on the condition that the king put down an enormous sum of money as a deposit, a guarantee that the precious originals would be returned. The king paid the vast deposit, and the scrolls were sent to Alexandria. And then, when the time came to return them, The king simply kept the originals, forfeited the deposit, and sent the Athenians the copies instead, judging, no doubt correctly, that the authentic master texts of the great tragedies were worth far more than any sum of gold. The Athenians were furious, but there was nothing they could do. The book stayed in Alexandria. Such was the passion and the ruthlessness with which the Great Library was built. By these means, and by many others, the collection grew and grew, until it reached a size that staggered the ancient world and has been debated by scholars ever since. The ancient writers speak of hundreds of thousands of scrolls, and some of the figures they give run to 500,000 and beyond. We cannot know the true number, and much depends on how one counts. For a single long work might be spread across many scrolls, so that one book, in our sense, might be a dozen rolls upon the shelves. But whatever the exact figure, there is no doubt that the Library of Alexandria held, at its height, by far the largest gathering of written knowledge that had ever existed anywhere in the world, an accumulation of learning so vast that nothing to rival it would be seen again for many centuries. To understand what that collection truly was, we must picture the books themselves, for they were not books as we know them, with pages bound between covers. They were scrolls, and the material on which they were written was papyrus, that remarkable substance made from a reed that grew in abundance in the marshes of the Nile, so that Egypt, and Alexandria above all, was the great source of writing material for the entire ancient world. To make papyrus, the pith of the reed was cut into thin strips, and the strips were laid side by side in 2 layers, one running one way and one crossing it, and then pressed and dried until they fused into a smooth, pale, flexible sheet, ready to be written upon. These sheets were glued end to end into long strips, and the strip was wound around a rod of wood to make a scroll. A reader would hold the scroll in both hands, unrolling it from one side and rolling it up on the other, so that a column of writing at a time passed before the eyes. The whole work scrolling by, quite literally, beneath the reader's gaze. Every one of these scrolls had to be written by hand, letter by letter, by a scribe, and so every book was a labor of days or weeks of patient copying. And because each copy was made by hand from another copy, errors crept in. A misread word here, a skipped line there, small mistakes multiplying down the generations of copies, until the text of an old and famous work might exist in many different and conflicting versions. This was one of the great tasks of the scholars of Alexandria, to gather the many copies of a work, to compare them line by line, to weigh the variants and correct the errors, and to establish as nearly as they could the true and original text of what the author had written. The library was not merely a storehouse of scrolls. It was a great workshop of the written word, where the texts of the ancient world were gathered, compared, corrected, catalogued, and preserved, tended by generations of scholars who gave their lives to the care of the words of the dead. In time, the collection grew so large that a single building could not hold it all, and a second library was established elsewhere in the city. A daughter library housed within the great temple of the god Serapis, a magnificent sanctuary that stood upon a height and was itself one of the wonders of Alexandria. This daughter library at the temple, which held many tens of thousands of scrolls of its own, would come to play its own part in the long story of the library's end, and it is worth remembering that when we speak of the Great Library of Alexandria, we are really speaking of more than one collection. The main library, in or near the royal quarter by the harbor, bound up with the museum and the palace. And this second library at the temple of Serapis, up in the city. The knowledge of Alexandria was gathered in more than one place, and this, as we shall see, is part of why its ending is so difficult to trace. For there was no single building whose burning we could point to and say, there, on that night, the library died. The library was placed, from the beginning, under the care of a chief librarian, and the men who held this office were among the most learned of the age, appointed by the king himself, and often serving also as tutors to the royal children. The role of the head librarians of Alexandria reads like a catalogue of the great scholars of the Hellenistic world. There was Zenodotus, the first of them, who began the enormous task of sorting and arranging the scrolls, and who did pioneering work on the text of Homer. There was Apollonius, a great poet in his own right, the author of a famous epic of the voyage of the heroes in search of the Golden Fleece. There was Eratosthenes, of whom we shall have much more to say, a man of such universal learning that he turned his mind to nearly every field of knowledge. There was Aristophanes of Byzantium, a brilliant scholar of language, who invented systems of marking the texts that were the distant ancestors of our own punctuation and accents. And there was Aristarchus of Samothrace, the greatest of the ancient critics of Homer, whose careful additions shaped the very text of the poems that has come down to us. Under the guidance of such men, the library became not only the largest collection of books in the world, but the greatest center of scholarship, the place where the very science of studying and preserving texts was born. The library grew so famous, and the Ptolemies so proud of it, that in time it acquired a great rival, and the story of that rivalry gave the world a gift that has lasted to this day. Far to the north, in Asia Minor, there ruled another line of wealthy and ambitious kings, the rulers of the city of Pergamon, and they too dreamed of glory and learning. And they too set about building a great library, gathering scrolls and scholars to their own city in imitation of Alexandria. The library of Pergamon grew until it was the second greatest in the world, and a fierce rivalry sprang up between the two, each king striving to outdo the other, to attract the finest scholars, and to acquire the rarest and most precious books, bidding against one another across the sea for the treasures of the written word. This rivalry, so the ancient story goes, grew so bitter that the Ptolemies took a drastic step to hamper their competitor. Egypt, and Alexandria above all, was the great source of papyrus for the whole ancient world, and the kings of Alexandria, it is said, cut off the export of papyrus to Pergamon, hoping to starve the rival library of the very material on which books were written, and so to halt its growth. It was a cunning stroke, for without papyrus, how could the scribes of Pergamon copy their scrolls? But the plan, if it was ever truly made, backfired in the most fruitful way imaginable. For the scholars of Pergamon denied their papyrus, turned to another writing material, one made not from a reed, but from the skins of animals, carefully cleaned and scraped and smoothed and treated, until they became thin, pale, durable sheets that could be written upon on both sides. This material we call parchment, and its very name recalls the city of Pergamon, where its use was perfected in answer to the Ptolemies' embargo, and parchment proved to be, in some ways, a better thing than papyrus itself. It was far more durable. Where papyrus grew brittle and crumbled with age, especially in damp climates, parchment could last for many centuries. And because it was strong and flexible and could be written on both sides, sheets of parchment could be folded and stitched together along one edge into the form of a book with turning pages, the form we call a codex, rather than a long-rolled scroll. In the centuries to come, this new form, the bound book of parchment pages, would gradually replace the scroll throughout the world, becoming the ancestor of every book we have ever held. So the great rivalry between the two libraries, and the Ptolemies' attempt to strangle their competitor, led, by a wonderful irony, to the birth of the very form in which books would be made for the next 2,000 years, and to a writing material tough enough to carry much of the ancient world's learning safely down through the ages, long after the fragile papyrus scrolls of Alexandria had crumbled into dust. It is said that, much later, when Alexandria's collection had suffered its losses, a Roman leader made a gift to the last of the Ptolemies, the Queen Cleopatra, of the whole vast library of Pergamon, hundreds of thousands of scrolls, carried to Alexandria to replenish its shelves. So that in the end, the two great rival collections may have flowed together into one. Whether or not that gift was truly made, there is a fitting poetry in the thought that the two greatest libraries of the ancient world, born as rivals, should at the last be joined. And around the library, in the museum, there gathered the most extraordinary community of thinkers that the ancient world ever assembled in one place. And it is to them that we now turn. For the true glory of Alexandria was not the scrolls upon its shelves, but the minds that those scrolls set to work. For close to 1,000 years, The greatest names in ancient science and scholarship are bound up, in one way or another, with Alexandria, and the discoveries made there, in those halls beside the sea, laid foundations of human knowledge that endure to this very day. Consider first the mathematicians, for it was in Alexandria, in the early years of the library, that there worked a man whose name every schoolchild still learns. A geometer named Euclid. Euclid gathered together the mathematical knowledge of his age, the theorems of the geometers who had gone before him, and he arranged it all into a single, magnificent, logical structure. Beginning from a handful of simple definitions and self-evident truths in building, step by careful step, proof upon proof, into the whole soaring edifice of geometry. The book in which he set this down became the most successful textbook in the entire history of the world. For more than 2,000 years, down almost to our own time, students learned their geometry from Euclid. From the very structure of definitions and proofs that he laid out in Alexandria, and the way of thinking he embodied, the patient building of certain truth by pure reason from first principles, became one of the great models of the human mind. There is an old story that when the king found the study of geometry difficult and asked whether there might be some easier, shorter path to learning it, Euclid replied that there was no royal road to geometry, no special shortcut even for a king. Whether he truly said it or not, the answer captures the spirit of the place, a spirit of rigorous, patient, honest inquiry, in which even the mightiest ruler must submit to the discipline of truth. The great inventor Archimedes, the most brilliant mathematician and engineer of the ancient world, is thought to have studied in Alexandria in his youth, and he kept up a correspondence with the scholars there throughout his life, sending them his discoveries and his challenges. Alexandria was the place to which the learned of the whole Mediterranean world looked, the hub of a great network of knowledge, where scholars gathered and studied and then carried what they had learned back to their own lands, or wrote to one another across the sea, exchanging their findings, building upon one another's work, in a great collective enterprise of understanding the world. It was, in a very real sense, the first time in human history that such a thing had been done on such a scale, and the results were extraordinary. Yet we should not imagine these scholars as bloodless saints of learning, floating serenely above all human concerns. They were men, living together in close quarters year after year, fed and housed and salaried by the king, freed from the ordinary struggles of life, and like any such community, they had their share of vanity and rivalry and pettiness alongside their brilliance. They competed for the king's favor and for the honor of the chief posts. They quarreled over questions of scholarship with a ferocity that seems, at this distance, almost comic. The most famous of these feuds set the great cataloguer of the library against another leading poet of the day, a bitter and long-running literary quarrel over the proper way to write poetry, conducted in verses full of veiled insults, that divided the learned world of Alexandria into hostile camps. There were satirists, too, who mocked the whole enterprise. One sharp-tongued philosopher of the age scoffed at the well-fed scholars of the museum, describing them as a flock of pampered bookish birds, endlessly squabbling in the bird-cage of the muses, kept plump and comfortable by the king, while they pecked at one another over trifles. It was an unkind jest, but not entirely an unfair one, for the very security that the museum offered, the freedom from all worldly care, could breed a certain closed and quarrelsome smallness alongside its great achievements. But this too is part of what makes the story human, and worth remembering, for it reminds us that the great works of Alexandria were made not by perfect beings, but by real people, with all the flaws and follies of real people, who nonetheless, out of their vanity and their brilliance and their rivalry and their love of learning, together accomplished things that changed the world. The scholar who measured the earth may have been, in the next breath, arguing furiously with a colleague over a line of poetry. The men who preserved the text of Homer may have been jealous of one another's reputations. And yet, the earth was measured, and Homer was preserved, and the work got done. There is something encouraging in that, something that brings these distant giants closer to us, and makes their achievements feel, somehow, more possible. Greatness does not require perfection. It requires only that real, flawed, quarrelsome, ordinary human beings should, despite everything, love the truth enough to seek it, and love beauty enough to preserve it, and go on doing the work, day after day, in the company of others who love the same things. That is how the Library of Alexandria did what it did, and that, perhaps, is how anything worthwhile has ever been done. Perhaps the single most beautiful achievement of Alexandrian science was the work of that same Eratosthenes, who served as chief librarian. For he did something that seems almost impossible. Sitting in Egypt, with nothing but simple observations and careful reasoning, he measured the size of the entire earth, and he got the answer very nearly right. The story of how he did it is one of the loveliest in the history of science, and it is worth telling slowly, for it shows the pure power of a thinking mind. Eratosthenes had learned that far to the south of Alexandria, in a city on the Nile, there was a deep well, and that on a single particular day of the year, the day of the summer solstice. At noon, the sun shone directly down into that well and lit up the water at the very bottom, casting no shadow at all, because the sun stood exactly overhead. But he knew that on that same day, at that same hour, in Alexandria to the north, the sun did not stand quite overhead, for a vertical rod set in the ground at Alexandria cast a short shadow at noon on the solstice. Now Eratosthenes reasoned, if the earth were flat, the sun's rays, coming from so far away, would strike every point in the same direction, and a rod at Alexandria would cast no shadow either, just as at the well in the south. But there was a shadow, and the only way to explain that shadow was that the surface of the earth was curved, that Alexandria and the southern city lay upon the curve of a great sphere, so that a rod standing straight up at one place pointed in a slightly different direction than a rod at the other. By measuring the exact length of the shadow at Alexandria, Eratosthenes could measure the angle of that difference, the angle between the two cities as seen from the center of the earth. And then, knowing the distance between the two cities, which could be found by measuring how far it was along the ground, he had everything he needed. For if a certain distance on the ground corresponded to a certain small angle at the center of the earth, then the whole circle of the earth, the full turn all the way around, must be as many times greater than that distance as the full circle of degrees is greater than that small angle. It was a simple proportion, and he worked it out, and he arrived at a figure for the circumference of the entire earth. And his figure was astonishingly close to the truth. From a shadow in a courtyard, and the distance between two Egyptian cities, using nothing but geometry and the light of the sun, a man in Alexandria more than 2,000 years ago calculated the size of the whole planet and came within a small margin of the value we know today. There is no finer example of what the human mind can do, and no finer emblem of the spirit of Alexandria, where such things were not only possible, but expected, where scholars turned the full force of their reason upon the world and wrested from its secrets that no one had ever known before. That a person could sit in a library beside the sea and measure the earth itself is one of the quiet marvels of history, and it happened here. The astronomers of Alexandria reached out even further, beyond the earth, to the sun and the moon and the wandering stars. One of them, a bold thinker named Aristarchus, made a leap of imagination so far ahead of his time that the world was not ready for it, and would not be for nearly 2,000 years. Looking at the heavens and reasoning about the sizes and distances of the sun and the earth, Aristarchus concluded that it was not the earth that stood at the center of everything, with the sun and the stars wheeling around it, as everyone believed, but rather that the earth itself moved, that it and the other wandering stars circled around the sun, and that the sun stood still at the center. It was a breathtaking idea, the true shape of the heavens glimpsed clearly by a single mind. And it was, as we now know, correct. But it was too strange, too much against the evidence of the senses and the belief of the age, and it was set aside and nearly forgotten, to lie dormant for 18 centuries, until, in a later age, another astronomer would take it up again and change the world. That the idea was ever conceived at all, so long ago, is one more testament to the reach of the minds that gathered at Alexandria. Another great astronomer, Hipparchus, working partly from the vast records of ancient observations that the library had gathered from Babylon and elsewhere, made careful measurements of the positions of the stars and the motions of the sun and moon. And he compiled a great catalogue of the stars, and he discovered subtle, slow movements in the heavens that no one had noticed before. And in a later age, a scholar known to history simply as Ptolemy, who worked in Alexandria long after the Ptolemaic kings were gone, gathered up all this astronomical knowledge into a single great work that would govern the understanding of the heavens for the next 1400 years. A book so authoritative that it shaped how all the peoples of Europe and the Islamic world pictured the cosmos until the very dawn of modern science. Whatever its errors, and it had them, it was one of the most influential books ever written, and it too was a fruit of Alexandria, of the great tradition of patient observation and careful reasoning that flourished in that city beside the sea. The scholars of Alexandria mapped not only the heavens but the earth itself. And here again the many-minded Eratosthenes led the way. For besides measuring the size of the world, he set out to describe its shape and its lands. And in doing so, he more or less founded the science of geography, even giving it the name by which we still call it, a word that means, quite simply, the writing of the earth, drawing on the reports of travelers and traders and soldiers who had journeyed to the far corners of the known world, on the records gathered in the library from every land, and on the measurements of the astronomers. He attempted to draw a map of the whole inhabited earth, and he did something that was wonderfully clever and wholly new. He ruled his map with lines, imaginary lines running across it, some from north to south and some from east to west, so that any place could be fixed by its position relative to these lines, and distances and directions could be reasoned about with something like mathematical precision. It was the distant ancestor of the grid of latitude and longitude, by which we locate every point on the globe to this day, and it was born, like so much else, in the Library of Alexandria. Through this patient gathering of the reports of countless travelers, the scholars of Alexandria assembled a picture of the world far wider and truer than anyone had held before, learning of distant lands and seas and peoples, of the sources of great rivers and the shapes of far coastlines, piecing together, scroll by scroll and account by account, a vision of the whole earth as it was then known. This was the library at its most characteristic and its best, taking in knowledge from every quarter of the world, from every returning ship and every questioned traveler, and weaving it together, through reason and comparison, into an understanding that no single person and no single people could ever have reached alone. It was collaboration across distance and across time, the pooling of what many minds and many places had seen and learned, and it produced a knowledge of the world that was one of the wonders of the age. And all of it depended, utterly, on the great collection of scrolls, the gathered reports and records and measurements, without which none of these connections could have been made. The map of the world was drawn, in the end, out of the library itself. The scholars of Alexandria turned their gaze not only outward to the stars but inward, to the human body itself. And here too they made discoveries that would not be equaled for many centuries. In the early years of the city, for a brief and remarkable period, the physicians of Alexandria were permitted to do something that was forbidden almost everywhere else in the ancient world, and would be forbidden again soon after. They were allowed to dissect the human body, to open it and study its inner workings directly, rather than merely guessing at them from the outside. And so, for a short golden age, the anatomists of Alexandria came to understand the structure of the body with a clarity that no one had achieved before. One of them traced the nerves, and understood that they ran to the brain, and grasped that it was the brain, and not the heart. That was the center of thought and sensation, and the seat of the intelligence. He studied the eye, and the organs, and the great vessels, and gave names to parts of the body that we use to this day. Another studied the workings of the heart, and the flow of the blood, and the action of the lungs. For a brief span, in Alexandria, the human body gave up more of its secrets than it would again for a very long time. And though much of this knowledge, too, would be lost or forgotten in the long decline that was to come, the memory of it, and some of its findings, survived to enrich the medicine of later ages. Nor was the genius of Alexandria confined to pure thought and abstract reasoning, for the city was also home to a remarkable tradition of inventors and engineers, practical men who turned their understanding of the world to the making of ingenious machines. One of them, in the early days, laid the foundations of the science of air and water under pressure, and from his work came a whole family of clever devices. An improved water clock that measured the hours by the steady flow of water far more accurately than anything before it. A water organ that produced music by driving air through pipes with the pressure of water, and pumps that could force water upward against its will. Another, in a later age, was perhaps the most inventive of them all, a maker of wonders whose surviving descriptions read like the notebook of a magician. He devised temple doors that seemed to open by themselves when a fire was lit upon the altar, worked by the hidden expansion of heated air. He built little mechanical theaters in which figures moved and acted out whole scenes on their own, driven by falling weights and turning drums and chords. He made, it is said, a device into which one dropped a coin, and out of which came a measured amount of holy water. The very first coin-operated machine in all of history, standing in a temple more than 2,000 years ago. And most astonishing of all, this same inventor built a device in which steam from a heated cauldron was piped into a hollow metal sphere, and escaped from it through two bent nozzles, and the force of the escaping steam spun the sphere around and around upon its axis. It was, in essence, a steam engine, a machine driven by the power of steam, built nearly 2,000 years before the great steam engines that would one day transform the world and usher in a whole new age of industry. But in Alexandria it was regarded only as an ingenious toy, a marvel to amuse and astonish, and no one thought to put its power to any practical use. It spun there in the ancient workshop, a glimpse of a future that would not arrive for 18 centuries, and then it was set aside, and its secret, like so much else, was very nearly lost. It is one of the great tantalizing what-ifs of history that the power of steam was discovered and demonstrated, and then simply forgotten in that city of inventors beside the sea so long before the world was ready to grasp what it might mean. And it stands as one more emblem of Alexandria, where the human mind reached so far ahead of its age, glimpsing truths and possibilities that would not be seized again for 1,000 years and more. And then there were the scholars of words, the students of literature and language, and their work, though it may seem quieter than the measuring of the earth or the mapping of the stars, was in its own way just as important, for it is very largely thanks to them that we have any of the literature of the ancient world at all. Their great task was to gather, to sort, to correct, and to preserve the written inheritance of the Greeks, and they went about it with a devotion and a rigor that laid the foundations of all later scholarship. The most famous of them was a poet and scholar named Callimachus, who undertook a labor of almost unimaginable scale. He set out to catalogue the entire library. He created a great work, running to many scrolls of its own, in which he listed the authors whose works the library held, arranged by subject, with information about each author and a list of his writings, and even the opening words and the length of each work. It was, in effect, the first great catalogue of a library, a map of the whole collection, a guide by which a scholar could find his way through the hundreds of thousands of scrolls. In creating it, Callimachus more or less invented the science of organizing knowledge, of imposing order upon a vast collection of books so that any one of them could be found. Every catalogue and every library since, down to the systems by which we organize all the world's information today, descends in spirit from the work that Callimachus did in Alexandria. Others among these scholars of words devoted their lives to the poems of Homer, the two great epics that stood at the very foundation of Greek culture, the poems that every educated Greek knew and loved, that were, in a sense, the shared inheritance and the common scripture of the whole Greek world. But the poems existed in many copies, and the copies differed, and over the centuries the text had grown uncertain and corrupt. And so the Homeric scholars of Alexandria gathered all the copies they could find, and compared them line by line, weighing every difference, marking the lines they thought genuine and the lines they suspected had been added later, striving to recover the true and original text of the poems. They developed a whole system of little marks and symbols to note their judgments in the margins, and they wrote long commentaries explaining their reasoning. It was painstaking, patient, unglamorous work, the work of lifetimes bent over old scrolls, and it is because of that work that the text of Homer came down through the ages in the form it did. When we read those ancient poems today, we are reading, in large part, the text that the scholars of Alexandria labored to establish, more than 2,000 years ago, in the halls of the museum. And it was in Alexandria, too, that one of the most consequential translations in all of history was made. The city was home to a great community of Jews, one of the largest anywhere in the world, and many of them, living among the Greeks, had come to speak Greek as their everyday tongue, and no longer knew the ancient Hebrew of their scriptures. And so, according to the tradition, under one of the early Ptolemies, a company of Jewish scholars undertook to translate the sacred books of the Hebrew Bible into Greek, so that they could be read by those who knew only that language. This Greek translation of the Hebrew scriptures was a monumental achievement. The first time those sacred books had been rendered into another tongue. A beautiful legend grew up around how it was made. According to the story, the king who desired the translation for his library sent to the high priest in Jerusalem and asked him to send scholars capable of the task. And there came to Alexandria a company of some 70 learned men, 6 from each of the 12 tribes of Israel. And it is from their number that the translation took the name by which it is still known, a name that means simply the 70. The legend tells that these 70 scholars were housed, each apart from the others, and each set to translate the sacred text alone, without consulting his fellows, and that when their work was done and their versions were compared, every one of the 70 translations was found to agree with all the others, word for word, exactly alike, which was taken as a sign that the translation had been guided by the hand of God. Whether or not it happened so, the story captures the reverence with which this great work was regarded, and the sense that here, in Alexandria, something of lasting sacred importance had been accomplished. And accomplished it was, for this translation would carry the scriptures of the Jews out into the wider Greek-speaking world. In the centuries to come, this very translation would become the version of the scriptures used by the early Christians, quoted in their writings and spread across the Roman world, so that the words first turned from Hebrew into Greek by scholars in Alexandria would shape the religious life of a great part of humankind for 2,000 years. Such was the reach of the work done in that city. It touched the heavens and the earth, the body and the word, and even the sacred books of a people, and its influence flows on, unseen, into our own day. For a century and more then, the library and the museum blazed with this extraordinary light, the greatest concentration of learning the world had ever seen, sustained by the wealth and the will of the Ptolemaic kings. But nothing made by human hands lasts forever, and the light of Alexandria, though it burned for a very long time, did not burn steadily. It flickered, and dimmed, and flared again across the long centuries of its decline, and the story of what happened to the Great Library is really the story of that long, slow, uneven fading, wound about with fire and war and neglect, and the quiet crumbling of time. Let us follow it now, from the first shadows to the final darkness, and try to see, as clearly as we can, how so much light came at last to go out. The first shadows fell not from fire or foreign enemy, but from within, from the troubles of the dynasty that had created the library in the first place. As the generations passed, the Ptolemaic kings grew less like the wise and cultured founders of the line, and more like the quarrelsome, scheming, and often murderous rulers of a declining house, consumed by their own bloody family struggles for the throne. And in the course of one of these struggles, a little more than a century after the library's founding, a king came to power who turned against the scholars of the museum, whom he suspected of having supported his rivals. This king, in his anger, drove the scholars out. He expelled the learned men from Alexandria, stripping them of their royal support and forcing them to flee the city, and they scattered across the Greek world, carrying their learning with them to other cities. to Athens and Rhodes and Pergamon and beyond. In one sense, this was a disaster for Alexandria, for it broke, at least for a time, the great community of scholars that had made the city the center of the world's learning, and it ended the long period of unbroken royal patronage under which that community had flourished. The museum would recover, and scholars would return, and Alexandria would remain a center of learning for centuries yet. But something of its early concentrated brilliance was never fully regained. And yet there is another way to see this scattering, a gentler way, and it is worth holding on to. For when the scholars fled Alexandria, they carried the learning of the museum out into the wider world, seeding other cities with the knowledge and the methods and the very books of Alexandria, so that the light of the Great Library was, in a sense, not extinguished but dispersed, spread abroad to kindle new fires elsewhere. This will become a theme as we follow the long decline, that knowledge once truly created and shared is very hard to destroy completely, that it has a way of surviving in copies and in memories and in the minds of those who carry it away, even as its original home crumbles. But that is to look ahead. For now, the first shadow had fallen, and the great age of the library was passing. The most famous of all the supposed destructions of the library came in the time of the last and most famous of the Ptolemies, the Queen Cleopatra. And it involved one of the most famous men in all of history, the Roman general, Julius Caesar. By this time the power of Rome had spread across the whole Mediterranean world, and Egypt, though still ruled by its own queen, had fallen under the shadow of Roman might. Caesar came to Alexandria in the midst of a Roman civil war, and became entangled in the affairs of the Egyptian court, and in the struggle between Cleopatra and her rivals, and he found himself, with only a small force, besieged in the royal quarter of the city by a hostile Egyptian army. Hard-pressed, and in danger of being cut off, Caesar ordered his men to set fire to the enemy fleet in the harbor, hoping to prevent the ships from being used against him. The fire took hold and spread, leaping from the ships to the buildings along the waterfront, and it burned fiercely through the dockside quarter of the city. And here is where the famous story arises. For some of the ancient writers tell us that this fire, spreading from the harbor, reached the library and consumed it, destroying its countless scrolls in the flames of Caesar's war. For centuries this has been the popular answer to our question, the dramatic single catastrophe that everyone remembers, that Julius Caesar, by accident, in the confusion of a siege, burned down the Great Library of Alexandria. But when we look closely at the evidence, the picture becomes far less certain and far more interesting. Some ancient sources do speak of a great loss of books in this fire, but others, writing of the years after Caesar's visit, speak of the library and the museum as though they were still there, still functioning, still full of scholars. It seems most likely that what burned in Caesar's fire was not the great library itself, tucked away in the royal quarter, but rather a large number of scrolls that happened to be stored in warehouses down by the harbor. Perhaps books awaiting export, or perhaps a portion of the collection kept near the docks. A grievous loss, certainly. Tens of thousands of scrolls, perhaps, but not the destruction of the whole library, which survived the fire and carried on. The truth, as so often in this story, is messier and less dramatic than the legend. Caesar's fire was one wound among many, a serious one, but not the death blow. The library lived on. It is worth pausing to ask why this particular fire, of all the wounds the library suffered, became the one that everyone remembers, the single dramatic answer that has echoed down the centuries. Part of the reason is simply that some of the ancient writers themselves reported it so, and gave great numbers for the scrolls destroyed, with one much-quoted figure putting the loss at some 400,000 rolls, an enormous number, whether or not it is accurate. But part of the reason lies deeper, in the way the human mind prefers its tragedies. A great and famous man, a single terrible night, a fire raging along the waterfront, all the knowledge of the world going up in flames at a stroke. It makes a powerful and memorable story. A story with a clear cause, and a clear moment, and a clear villain, or at least a clear accident to lay the blame upon. The truth, that the library declined slowly across centuries through 100 smaller causes makes a far less satisfying tale. It has no single dramatic scene, no one to blame, no moment of horror to fix in the memory. And so, over the long ages, the mind of the world reached for the fire, the vivid and terrible fire, and made it stand for the whole long, dull, sorrowful process of decline, because a single blaze is so much easier to remember and to mourn than a slow fading spread thin across 300 years. We should be gentle with ourselves for preferring the story of the fire. It is a very human thing to want a loss to have a shape, a cause, a moment. But if we wish to know what truly happened, we must set the vivid legend gently aside and look instead at the slower, quieter, sadder truth. Not long after Caesar's time, the age of the Ptolemies came to its end. Cleopatra, the last of the line, was defeated by Rome, and with her death Egypt ceased to be an independent kingdom and became a province of the Roman Empire, ruled now from far away by the emperors in Rome. And this change, though it brought no fire and no sudden catastrophe, marked the beginning of a slow and fateful shift in the fortunes of the library. For the library and the museum had been the creation and the pride of the Ptolemaic kings, sustained by their personal wealth and their personal devotion to learning. The scholars had been, in a sense, the honored guests of the crown, supported by the king because the king wished his city to shine as the brightest star of the world's culture. But now there was no king in Alexandria. There was only a Roman governor, answering to a distant emperor, whose concerns were spread across a vast empire and who had little personal stake in the glory of one provincial library. The Roman emperors did not neglect Alexandria entirely. For a long time the museum continued to receive support, and emperors appointed its members and took some interest in its affairs. And Alexandria remained one of the great cities of the empire and a center of learning to which students still came from across the Mediterranean world. But the special magic of the early days, the total devotion of a wealthy court to the single purpose of gathering and advancing all human knowledge, was gone, and it did not return. The support became more fitful, more a matter of routine than of passion. The membership of the museum came to include, over time, not only scholars but men honored for other reasons, favorites and officials for whom a place in the museum was a mark of status rather than a summons to research. Slowly, across the long Roman centuries, the institution drifted from a living center of discovery toward a more comfortable and less brilliant existence, resting on the glory of its past. This is not the kind of decline that leaves a mark in the histories. No burning, no sack, no single terrible day. It is the quieter decline of an institution losing its purpose and its patronage by slow degrees. And it may in the end have done more to empty the library than any fire ever did. Books that are not cared for decay. Scrolls that are not recopied crumble. A collection that no one is actively building and tending and renewing begins, silently, to die. And then, upon this slow inward fading, there fell a series of outward blows, as the Roman Empire itself descended into the great crisis of its 3rd century, that terrible age of civil wars and invasions and collapse through which the whole Roman world nearly tore itself apart. Alexandria, rich and populous and proud and often rebellious, was caught up again and again in these convulsions, and more than once it suffered grievously for it. In one of these episodes, a Roman emperor came to put down a rebellion in the city, and in the fighting and the reprisals that followed, the great royal quarter of Alexandria, the ancient heart of the city where the palaces and the museum and very likely the main library had always stood, was devastated, laid waste in the savagery of the war. Whatever remained of the original library in that quarter, after 3 centuries of Roman neglect, may well have perished in this destruction, not in a single famous fire, but in the general ruin of the district in which it stood. A generation or so later, the city was besieged, and stormed again in yet another war, and suffered yet more destruction. The old royal quarter, it seems, never fully recovered. Bit by bit, war by war, the ancient heart of Alexandria was broken, and with it, In all likelihood, went the last remnants of the great collection that the first Ptolemies had gathered there so long before. By now we have moved far from the Golden Age, far from Euclid and Eratosthenes and the measuring of the earth. We are in a harder, darker world, an age of decline and violence, in which the calm devotion to learning that had built the library seemed to belong to a vanished and half-legendary past. The main library, the great collection of the royal quarter, appears simply to fade from the record in these centuries, so gradually and so quietly that no ancient writer marks its passing. No one records the day it ceased to be. It did not die in a blaze that lit up the sky and echoed down the ages. It died the way most things die, slowly, unremarked, worn away by neglect, and broken by the general disasters of a declining world, until one day there was nothing left of it but a memory. And that, perhaps, is the truest and saddest answer to our question. But the story is not quite over, for there remained the daughter library, up in the temple of Serapis, and its ending, at least, was dramatic enough to be remembered. By the time we now reach, some 7 centuries after the library's founding, the whole world had changed. The Roman Empire had become a Christian empire, and the old religion of the Greeks and Romans and Egyptians, the worship of the ancient gods, was passing away, sometimes peacefully, and sometimes not. And in Alexandria, a city famous throughout its history for the fierceness of its passions and the violence of its mobs, the conflict between the old faith and the new grew especially bitter. At the center of the old religion in the city stood the great temple of Serapis, the magnificent sanctuary upon its height that had housed, for centuries, the daughter library of Alexandria. This temple was the proudest monument of the old gods in the city, and as such it became, in time, a target. Late in the 4th century of the Common Era, the emperor decreed that the temples of the old gods throughout the empire should be closed. And in Alexandria the bishop of the city set about carrying out this decree against the great temple of Serapis. There was violence, as there so often was in Alexandria. The followers of the old religion and the followers of the new clashed in the streets, and for a time the pagans barricaded themselves within the temple. But in the end, the old faith could not stand against the will of the emperor and the rising power of the church, and the great temple of Serapis was seized and destroyed, its statues thrown down, its sanctuary demolished, the proud monument of the old gods reduced to ruin. And with the temple, it seems, went whatever remained of the daughter library that had been housed there. Yet even here, at this famous and dramatic destruction, the truth is more uncertain than the legend, for it is not at all clear how many books still remained in the temple of Serapis by the time it was destroyed. Some of the ancient accounts of the temple's fall describe its halls and its sanctuary and its statues, but say little or nothing of a great library of scrolls perishing in the flames. It may be that by this late date, after so many centuries of decline and neglect, the daughter library too had already dwindled away, its scrolls dispersed or decayed, so that when the temple fell there were few books left in it to be lost. Or it may be that a substantial collection did perish. We cannot say for certain. But once again, we find that the reality resists the simple story. The destruction of the Temple of Serapis was a real and violent event, and it may well have swept away the last institutional remnant of the libraries of Alexandria. But it was not the burning of the great library in its glory, for that glory had faded centuries before. It was, rather, the demolition of a temple that had once, long ago, housed a great collection, most of which was very likely already gone. And so we come, at last, to the final and most famous legend of all. The story that many people still half believe, that the Great Library of Alexandria was destroyed by the Arabs at the time of the Muslim conquest of Egypt, about a century and a half after the fall of the Temple of Serapis. The armies of the new faith of Islam swept out of Arabia and conquered vast territories with astonishing speed, and among the lands they took was Egypt, and with it the great city of Alexandria. And there arose, long afterward, a famous and terrible story about what happened to the library at that time. According to this tale, when the city was taken, the Arab general wrote to the caliph, the ruler of the new empire, to ask what should be done with the great library of books that had been found in Alexandria. And the caliph, so the story goes, sent back a chilling reply. If these books agree with the Holy Scripture, he is said to have answered, then they are unnecessary and need not be kept. And if they disagree with the Holy Scripture, then they are undesirable and should not be kept. Either way, he commanded, let them be destroyed. And so, the legend concludes, the countless scrolls of Alexandria were distributed among the public baths of the city, to be used as fuel to heat the water, and it took 6 months to burn them all. It is a memorable and horrifying story, and it has been told and retold for 1,000 years. But almost every serious scholar who has examined it has concluded that it is, in all likelihood, a later invention, a legend with little or no basis in fact. It does not appear in any of the accounts written near the time of the conquest. It surfaces only centuries later. It does not fit what we know of the attitudes of the early Muslim conquerors, who often valued and preserved the learning of the peoples they conquered. And above all, it runs up against the simple fact that, by the time the Arabs came to Alexandria, there was almost certainly no great library left for them to burn. The main library had faded away centuries before. The daughter library in the temple of Serapis had perished, or dwindled to nothing, long since. The tale of the caliph and the baths is a story told about the destruction of something that in truth had already been gone for hundreds of years, a dramatic ending invented, perhaps, for a loss that had no dramatic ending at all. So let us now gather up all these threads and try to answer as truly as we can the question with which we began. What really happened to the Great Library of Alexandria? The honest answer, the answer that the careful weighing of the evidence gives us, is not the answer that legend prefers. There was no single night of fire. There was no one villain, no one torch, no one catastrophe that we can point to and say, there, in that moment, the library was lost. Instead, the Great Library died the slow death of 1,000 small wounds, spread across some 6 or 7 centuries. And no single one of those wounds was the death blow, because there was no single moment of death at all. Think of all that we have seen. There was the early expulsion of the scholars, which broke the great community and scattered its learning. There was the fire of Caesar, which very likely destroyed a large store of scrolls near the harbor, a serious loss, but not the end. There was the long, slow withdrawal of royal and imperial patronage after the Ptolemies were gone, the quiet fading of the passion that had built and sustained the collection, so that fewer scrolls were bought and copied and cared for, and the collection ceased to grow and began, imperceptibly, to shrink. There were the terrible wars of the 3rd century, in which the ancient royal quarter that had housed the main library was devastated, perhaps carrying off whatever remained there. There was the destruction of the temple of Serapis, which swept away the daughter library, or what was left of it. And running beneath all of these, silent and relentless, there was the simple decay of the material itself. For papyrus does not last forever, especially in a damp climate near the sea. And a scroll that is not recopied before it crumbles is a book lost as surely as one thrown into the fire. A library is not a permanent thing that endures, unless it is destroyed. A library is a living thing that must be constantly tended, its books recopied as they age, its collection renewed, or it will quietly die of its own accord, even if no enemy ever lifts a hand against it. This is the deep truth that the legend of the Great Fire obscures, and it is a truth worth sitting with, for it is both sadder and more important than the legend. We like to imagine that a great treasure of knowledge, if it is lost, must be lost in some dramatic act of destruction, some villain's crime that we can name and condemn. It is somehow comforting to have someone to blame, a Caesar, or a caliph, or a fanatic mob, a single wicked act that explains the loss. But the real story of the Library of Alexandria is that its greatest enemy was not fire or malice at all. Its greatest enemies were neglect, and indifference, and the slow passage of time. The library was not murdered in a night. It was allowed to fade over centuries, because the will and the wealth and the care that had created it were not sustained, because each generation left a little less than it had received, because the constant, patient, unglamorous labor of keeping a great collection alive was little by little allowed to lapse. And that is a far more sobering lesson than any tale of a single great fire, for it reminds us that knowledge does not preserve itself, that even the greatest gathering of learning the world has ever known can simply crumble away if it is not cherished and tended and passed on, and that the loss, when it comes, may be so gradual and so quiet that no one even notices the day it is complete. We do not know when that day was. That is perhaps the strangest and most haunting part of the whole story. There is no date we can write down, no moment we can mark, for the death of the Great Library of Alexandria. Somewhere in the long twilight of the ancient world, in some year that no one recorded, the last of its scrolls crumbled to dust, or was carried off, or was simply forgotten upon a shelf in a building that had ceased to be a library at all, and no one noted it, and no one mourned. The greatest library in the history of the ancient world did not end with a bang or even, really, with a whimper. It ended in silence, in a slow fading into nothing, so complete and so quiet, that even now, 2,000 years later, we cannot say for certain how or when the light finally went out. Let us pause now and consider what was lost, for it is only when we grasp the scale of the loss that we feel the full weight of this quiet tragedy. The Library of Alexandria, at its height, held very nearly the whole of the written knowledge of the ancient world, and only a small fraction of that knowledge has come down to us. When we read the literature of ancient Greece today, we are reading the survivors, the fortunate few works that happen to be copied often enough and preserved carefully enough to make it through the long centuries to us. Behind those survivors stretches a vast shadow world of everything that did not survive, and the size of that shadow is staggering. Consider the great tragic poets of Athens, whose master copies the Ptolemies had seized. Each of them wrote scores upon scores of plays, dozens and dozens of works, performed and celebrated and treasured in their own time. And of all those plays, only a handful of each poet's work has survived to be read today, a few dozen out of hundreds, while the rest are gone, lost entirely, so that we know of them only their titles, listed in some ancient catalogue, or a stray line or two quoted by a later writer. Whole plays by the greatest dramatists of the ancient world, plays that were once known and loved, have vanished so completely that not a single copy remains anywhere on earth. And the same is true across every field of ancient learning. Histories of nations that no other source records. Works of philosophy that would have changed our picture of ancient thought. Poems, scientific treatises, works of mathematics and medicine and geography. The writings of authors whose very names are now barely known. All of it once gathered on the shelves of Alexandria, and almost all of it now gone. Think of Aristarchus, who grasped that the earth moves around the sun. His great work on that subject is lost. We know of his astonishing idea only because a few other ancient writers happened to mention it. Think of the anatomists who understood the workings of the body. Their detailed writings are lost, and we know their findings only in fragments, quoted by later physicians. Again and again, when we look at the achievements of the ancient world, we find that the original works have perished, and that we glimpse them only second-hand, in quotations and summaries and stray references, like seeing the shape of a great building only by the shadow it once cast. The Library of Alexandria was the place where all of this was gathered and preserved, and when it faded away, so much of it faded with it, and the world became, in a way that is almost impossible to measure, poorer than it had been, robbed of the thoughts and the discoveries and the beauty of countless minds, whose work was allowed to slip away into the dark. We will never know the full extent of what we lost. That is part of the sorrow of it. There may have been discoveries made in Alexandria that would have advanced human knowledge by centuries, insights into the heavens or the body or the world that, had they survived, might have changed the whole course of history, and that instead simply vanished, unread, uncopied, forgotten. so that later ages had to discover the same truths all over again, or never discovered them at all. When Aristarchus glimpsed that the earth moves around the sun, and the idea was set aside and lost, the world had to wait 1800 years for another mind to see it again. How many other such glimpses were there in the scrolls of Alexandria that were not seen again for centuries, or that were never seen again at all? We cannot know. The knowledge is gone, and with it even the knowledge of what the knowledge was. This is the deepest loss of all, not merely the works we know we are missing, whose titles survive to reproach us, but the works we do not even know existed, the discoveries and the beauties that vanished so completely that they left no trace at all, not even a shadow, not even a name. But let us not linger only in the sorrow of the loss. Let us go back, for a little while, and simply be there, in the library at its height, in the great days of its glory, and walk through it as though in a dream, with nothing to mourn and nothing to solve, only the quiet beauty of the place to rest within as we drift toward sleep. Come then into the Museum of Alexandria on a bright morning in its golden age, when the scholars were many, and the shelves were full, and the light of learning burned at its brightest. It is early, and the air is still cool from the night, and it carries the smell of the sea, for the museum stands near the great harbor, and beyond its walls the Mediterranean stretches away blue and bright to the horizon. You pass beneath a colonnade of pale stone columns, and the morning light falls in long bars across the marble floor. And the sound of the city, the cries of the gulls and the calls of the fishermen, and the distant murmur of the waking streets, fades behind you into the deeper quiet of the halls of study. Somewhere a fountain is playing softly in a garden courtyard, where the scholars walk in the shade of the trees, deep in conversation, working out a problem of geometry or debating the meaning of a line of Homer, as they pace slowly back and forth beneath the leaves. You come into the great hall of the library itself, and it opens around you, cool and high and hushed. The walls are lined, from floor to ceiling, with the honeycombed shelves, the pigeonholes of wood in which the scrolls are stored, each roll lying on its side with its little identifying tag hanging down. Tens of thousands of them, ranks upon ranks, holding the gathered thought of the world. Ladders lean against the shelves for reaching the higher rows. Here and there a scholar stands searching along the shelves, or lifts down a scroll, and carries it to one of the tables set in the pools of light beneath the high windows. The only sounds are the soft ones, the whisper of papyrus as a scroll is unrolled, the scratch of a reed pen as a scribe copies a text, the low murmur of a reader speaking the words softly to himself as the ancients so often did, the occasional quiet footstep on the stone. At the long tables sit the scholars at their work. One bends over an ancient copy of a poem, comparing it against another, his finger moving along the lines, pausing to mark a variant in the margin. Another has spread before him a great chart of the heavens, and is plotting upon it the position of a planet, working from columns of numbers copied out of the old Babylonian records. Another sits surrounded by a heap of scrolls on the geography of distant lands, piecing together, from the reports of travelers and the measurements of the astronomers, a map of the whole known world. A physician consults a treatise on the workings of the body. A young student, newly come to the great city from some far corner of the Greek world, wanders wide-eyed among the shelves, scarcely able to believe that he stands in the presence of so many books, more than he had known existed in all the world. And over it all falls the calm morning light, and beyond the windows lies the bright and patient sea, and the whole place breathes with the deep, contented quiet of minds at work upon the things they love. This is the Library of Alexandria as it was, in the days of its glory, before the long twilight, before the fires and the neglect, and the slow fading into dust. Hold that image gently in your mind. Not the loss, not the empty shelves and the crumbling scrolls of the end, but this, the full shelves, the working scholars, the morning light, the sea beyond the columns, the greatest gathering of human knowledge in the ancient world, alive and humming with thought, on an ordinary bright morning 2,000 years ago. It was real. It happened. For a few golden centuries, in a white city on the coast of Egypt, human beings gathered together very nearly all that they knew, and set their finest minds to work upon it, and reached out and touched the stars and the earth and the deepest workings of the world. And though it faded, though it was lost, though we cannot even say how or when it ended, still it was. And the fact that it was is itself a kind of light that has never entirely gone out. And here we come to a gentler truth, one that softens the sorrow of the loss. For the story of the knowledge of Alexandria is not only a story of destruction, it is also, quietly, a story of survival, and of the remarkable ways in which learning, once truly created and shared, refuses to die completely. For while the library itself faded away, much of what it had held did not vanish with it, but escaped, in copies and in memories, out into the wider world, where it was carried onward by other hands and preserved through the long centuries by people who never saw Alexandria at all. Remember that the scholars expelled from Alexandria in the early days carried their learning with them to other cities. Remember that Alexandria was, throughout its life, the hub of a great network of learning, sending out copies of its texts and teaching generations of students who returned to their own lands carrying what they had learned. The knowledge of Alexandria was never locked away in a single place. It was always flowing outward, copied and recopied, taught and retaught, spread across the whole Mediterranean world. And so when the library itself declined, the most important and most beloved of its treasures had already been copied many times over and scattered far and wide. And these copies lived on. The works of Euclid, of Ptolemy the astronomer, of the great poets and philosophers, survived not because the original scrolls of Alexandria survived, for they did not, but because copies had been made, and copies of those copies, in an endless chain, reaching down through the centuries. In the long ages that followed the fall of the ancient world, that chain of copying was kept alive by patient hands in many places. In the great Christian city of Constantinople, the heir of Rome in the East, scholars and scribes preserved and copied the works of the ancient Greeks, keeping the old learning safe through the centuries. And when the new civilization of Islam arose and spread across the very lands where Alexandria stood, its scholars, far from destroying the learning of the ancients, sought it out eagerly, gathering up the works of the Greek philosophers and mathematicians and physicians and translating them into Arabic, studying them, preserving them, and building upon them. In the great cities of the Islamic world, in places like Baghdad, there arose new centers of learning that in some ways took up the fallen torch of Alexandria, houses of wisdom where the knowledge of the ancient world was translated and treasured and advanced. Much of the science of the Greeks survived, in fact, precisely because it was preserved in Arabic translation during the centuries when it was neglected in the Christian West, and it would later flow back into Europe from the Islamic lands, helping to rekindle the learning of the West. And so, when at last the great rebirth of learning that we call the Renaissance came to Europe, the works of the ancient world were there to be recovered, carried down through all those centuries of copying, in Greek and in Arabic and in Latin, preserved by the labor of countless anonymous scribes and scholars across 1,000 years and more. The knowledge that had been gathered in Alexandria was battered and diminished, and much of it was lost forever, but a precious core of it survived. Passed from hand to hand, from copy to copy, from language to language, from city to city, across the whole long span of the centuries, until it reached the modern world. When we read Euclid today, when we learn the geometry he taught, we are receiving, across 2,000 years, a gift that passed through the halls of Alexandria and survived the fall of the library that once held it. The light of Alexandria was dimmed, and much of it was lost, but it was never entirely extinguished. Some of it reaches us still. And that, perhaps, is the deepest lesson of all, that knowledge shared is knowledge that can survive, that the way to keep a thing from being lost forever is to copy it, and teach it, and give it away, so that it lives not in one fragile place, but in 1,000, and cannot be destroyed by any single fire or any single act of neglect, because it has become part of the common inheritance of humankind. And what of the city itself, the great white city of Alexandria that held the library, the shining metropolis of the Ptolemies? Its fate, too, is part of our story, and it is a strange and beautiful one, for the ancient city, like its library, has very largely vanished, though in its case we know a little more of how it went. In its glory, Alexandria was one of the wonders of the world, and at the mouth of its harbor there stood a wonder that was famous even among the ancients, listed among the 7 great marvels of the world, the lighthouse, the Pharos, a tower of pale stone rising to an astonishing height above the harbor, taller than almost any structure the ancient world ever built, at whose summit a great fire burned by night, its light thrown far out to sea by mirrors, guiding ships in from over the horizon toward the safe waters of the port. For centuries the Pharos stood, one of the tallest buildings on earth, the very symbol of Alexandria, a beacon that could be seen from far out upon the Mediterranean, welcoming travelers to the greatest city of learning in the world. But the coast of Egypt is a restless place, prone to earthquakes, and over the long centuries the great lighthouse was shaken again and again by the trembling of the earth, cracked and damaged and repaired and damaged again, until at last, after standing for the better part of 2,000 years, it fell, its stones tumbling into the sea, and the beacon of Alexandria was no more. In time, the fallen stones of the Pharos were gathered up and used to build a fortress on the same spot, so that a part of the ancient wonder lives on, transformed, in the walls of a later age, standing guard still over the mouth of the harbor where the great tower once burned. And the ancient royal quarter, the heart of Ptolemaic Alexandria, the district of palaces and gardens where the museum stood, and where the main library very likely lay, that too has largely vanished, and in the most poetic way of all, much of it now lies beneath the water. Over the centuries, earthquakes and the slow sinking of the land carried a whole portion of the ancient city down below the surface of the harbor, so that the palaces of the Ptolemies, the streets they walked, perhaps the very ground on which the great library once stood, now rest quietly on the seabed, beneath the blue water, where in modern times divers have gone down and found, in the green dimness, the toppled columns and the fallen statues and the sphinxes of the lost city, lying scattered on the bottom of the sea. There is something almost unbearably fitting in this, that the city of the drowned library should itself lie half-drowned beneath the waves, its glory sunk into the same patient sea that once stretched blue beyond the columns of the museum. The scholars are gone, and the scrolls are gone, and now even much of the city is gone, sunk into the water, or buried beneath the streets of the modern Alexandria that rose upon its ruins. Yet even now, the ancient city has not entirely disappeared. The modern Alexandria is a great and living city still, a bustling port of millions on the same shore where Alexander marked out his boundaries so long ago, its streets following, in places, the very grid the ancient planners laid down. Here and there among the modern buildings, fragments of the old world still stand, a great column of red stone, rising alone where the temple of Serapis once stood, one of the last upright monuments of ancient Alexandria still above the ground, catacombs cut into the rock, scattered stones and columns gathered in the museums, and in a fine and moving gesture. In our own age, a great new library has been built in Alexandria, upon the shore, near where the ancient one is thought to have stood, a modern house of learning raised deliberately to honor the memory of the library that was lost, and to carry its dream forward into a new millennium. The old library could not be brought back. Its scrolls are dust these 1,500 years and more. But the idea of it, the dream that first moved the Ptolemies, the dream of gathering the knowledge of the world into one place for the good of all, that dream did not die with the scrolls. It has been taken up again, in Alexandria, and in 1,000 other places across the world, and it lives on wherever human beings gather books and knowledge and set them free for others to read. There is something in the story of the Great Library that reaches deeper than the history of one city or one collection of scrolls, something that touches on what it is to be human. And it is worth dwelling on as our long journey draws toward its end. For the dream that built the Library of Alexandria, the dream of gathering together all that is known, of holding the whole of human understanding in one place where it will not be lost, is one of the oldest and most persistent of all human longings. And it did not begin in Alexandria, nor did it end there. It runs, like a bright thread, all through the long story of our kind. Long before Alexandria, in the ancient cities of Mesopotamia, kings had gathered collections of clay tablets, storing up the myths and the records and the wisdom of their peoples, and one great Assyrian king assembled a whole library of such tablets, gathering the literature of his world so that it might be preserved. The impulse is very old. It seems to be woven into us, this desire not merely to know things but to keep them, to write them down, to gather them, to guard them against forgetting, to pass them on to those who come after. We are the creatures who remember, who refuse to let our knowledge die with us, who build, generation after generation, upon the accumulated understanding of all the generations before. And a great library is the purest expression of that impulse, a place where the memory of a whole civilization is gathered and kept, where the thoughts of the dead are preserved so that the living may read them, where a young student may come and, in a single lifetime, drink in the wisdom that it took 1,000 years to accumulate. That is what Alexandria was, and that is why its loss strikes us so deeply. For in mourning the library we are mourning something more than a building full of scrolls. We are mourning the fragility of memory itself, the terrible ease with which the accumulated knowledge of ages can slip away, the fear that everything we know and treasure might one day be lost as completely as the plays of the ancient poets were lost. But we may take heart, too, for the dream that built Alexandria did not die with it. It rose again and again, in the monasteries where monks copied the ancient texts, in the houses of wisdom of the Islamic world, in the great libraries of the age of learning that followed, in every collection of books ever gathered and cared for and shared. And in our own age, that ancient dream has been renewed on a scale that the Ptolemies could never have imagined. For we now live in a time when the knowledge of the whole world is being gathered once again into a single accessible place. Not a building of scrolls this time, but a vast web of connected knowledge that spans the entire earth, reaching into nearly every home, holding more information than all the libraries of history combined, available to almost anyone who wishes to learn. It is, in a sense, the dream of Alexandria come true at last, on a scale beyond the wildest hopes of the kings who first conceived it, a universal library, holding the knowledge of the world, open to all. And yet the story of Alexandria whispers a warning even here, in the midst of our triumph. For that ancient library, too, seemed in its day to hold everything, to be permanent, to be beyond all danger of loss. And it faded away, not in a great fire, but through neglect and the slow passage of time, because the care that had built it was not sustained. Our own vast store of knowledge, for all its size, is no more permanent than theirs, unless we tend it. Knowledge still must be preserved, and copied, and passed on with care, or it will be lost, however much of it we gather. The lesson of Alexandria is not only a lesson about the past. It is a quiet reminder, whispered across 2,000 years, that the treasures of the mind are always fragile, always dependent on the care and the will of those who hold them, and that the work of remembering, of preserving, of passing on, is never finished, and must be taken up anew by every generation, forever. Let us give a thought then, before we close, to the tenders of the flame, the countless people across the ages whose patient, quiet labor kept the light of knowledge from going out. For the survival of learning through the long centuries was not the work of kings or conquerors or famous names. It was the work, above all, of the copyists, the anonymous men and women who sat, generation after generation, in the libraries and the monasteries and the schools, and copied out, by hand, letter by letter, word by word, the words of the ancients, so that as one scroll or one book crumbled with age, another stood ready to take its place. Theirs was the humblest and the most essential of all labors, unglamorous, unsung, endlessly repeated. And it is very largely to them, to those forgotten hands, that we owe whatever of the ancient world has come down to us at all. Picture one of them, in some quiet room in some later century, long after Alexandria itself was gone. A scribe sits at a sloping desk in the pale light of a window, an old and fragile manuscript propped open before him, and a fresh blank page waiting under his hand. Carefully, patiently, he reads a line from the old book and copies it onto the new page, and then the next line, and the next, hour after hour, day after day, giving a fresh life to words that were first written down 1,000 years before he was born. Words that would have died with the crumbling old book had he not sat down to copy them. He may not fully understand all that he copies. He may be tired, and the work may be tedious, and no one will ever know his name. But because he sits there and does his patient work, a poem or a treatise or a history survives a little longer, is handed on to another age, escapes. For now, the darkness that swallowed so much else. Multiply that single scribe by all the thousands upon thousands who did the same across all the centuries, and you begin to see the true shape of how knowledge survives, not by being locked away in one great and famous place, but by being copied, and copied again, and passed from patient hand to patient, hand down the long chain of the years. There is a deep and quiet nobility in this that is worth honoring. The great discoverers of Alexandria, the ones who measured the earth and mapped the stars, deserve their fame. But so, in their way, do the humble tenders of the flame, the librarians who kept the shelves in order, the scribes who copied the fading texts, the teachers who passed the old learning on to the young, the countless obscure people who loved knowledge enough to preserve it and to give it away. Without the brilliant discoverers, there would have been less worth preserving. But without the patient preservers, the discoveries would have been made and then lost, over and over, and nothing would ever have accumulated, and we would still be beginning again, in every generation, from nothing. Civilization itself, the whole long climb of human understanding, rests as much upon the quiet faithfulness of the preservers as upon the brilliance of the discoverers. And the story of the Library of Alexandria, which is a story of both the greatest discoveries and the greatest loss, reminds us to honor them both, those who find the light, and those who, humbly and faithfully, keep it burning and pass it on. And perhaps there is a comfort in this thought, too, for any of us who have ever felt small or wondered whether our own quiet efforts matter in the vast sweep of the world. For the survival of the whole treasure of human knowledge depended, in the end, not on the great and the famous, but on countless ordinary people doing their small, faithful part, copying a page, keeping a book, teaching a child, passing on a little of what they had received. None of them, alone, saved civilization, but all of them together did. And so it may be with any of us. We need not measure the earth or map the heavens to matter. We need only do our own small, faithful part in the great work of keeping and passing on what is good, and trust that our little effort, joined to the little efforts of countless others, adds up, in the end, to something far greater than ourselves. Something that endures long after we are gone. Let us return, one last time, to the library itself, but now not in its golden morning, rather in its long, quiet twilight, in the slow centuries of its fading, that we may make our peace with the way it ended, and find, even in that gentle darkness, a kind of calm. For the fading of the library was not a single terrible night, but a long, soft dimming, like an autumn afternoon, drawing slowly toward dusk, and there is a melancholy beauty in it that suits this quiet hour. Imagine the halls of the museum in one of those later centuries, when the great days were long past. The building still stands, but it is quieter now than it once was. Where there were once hundreds of scholars, there are now only a handful. Some of the shelves, which once were full, stand half empty, for scrolls have been lost, or carried away, or have crumbled with age and not been replaced, and there is no longer the wealth or the will to replace them as there once was. The light still falls through the high windows, and the sea still shines beyond the columns, but there is a stillness in the halls now, a sense of a great thing slowly winding down, of an ending approaching so gently that no one quite perceives it. An old scholar walks alone among the shelves in the afternoon light, running his hand along the scrolls, many of them the same scrolls that his teachers and his teachers' teachers studied long ago. He knows that things are not what they were. He has heard the old stories of the great days, of the crowded halls and the famous names, of the measuring of the earth and the mapping of the stars. But he does not know that he is near the end. No one ever knows they are near the end. He simply goes on with his work, reading and thinking and teaching the few students who still come, tending his small corner of the great inheritance. As the long afternoon draws on toward evening, and so it faded, gently, quietly, over generations, each one a little poorer than the last, until at some point that no one recorded, and no one could name, the last scholar closed the last scroll, and the Library of Alexandria, which had gathered the knowledge of the world and set the finest minds of the age to work upon it, simply ceased to be. There was no great fire lighting up the night. There was no villain to curse, no single catastrophe to mark upon the calendar of history. There was only the soft closing of a long, long day, the quiet fall of a dusk that had been gathering for centuries, the gentle passing of a great thing into memory. And perhaps, in the end, there is something almost merciful in that, something that spares us the sharp horror of a sudden loss and gives us instead the softer sorrow of a slow farewell. The library did not die screaming in the flames. It fell asleep, so slowly that no one saw it close its eyes. And in that image, perhaps, we may find our own way toward rest tonight. For everything passes, in time, gently or harshly. And even the greatest and most brilliant of the works of human beings must one day fade and be let go. The scholars of Alexandria are gone. Their scrolls are dust. Their city is half sunk beneath the sea. And yet the loss is not a thing of only sorrow, for what they made was real, and much of it survived, and the dream that moved them lives on in us. There is a peace to be found in accepting the long, slow turning of these great cycles of rising and fading, of building and losing and building again. A peace that comes from knowing that we are part of something far larger than ourselves, a great chain of remembering that stretches back to the first scratches on the first clay tablet and reaches forward beyond anything we can see, and that our own small part in it, however brief, is not without meaning and not without worth. And now our long journey through the story of the Great Library is nearly done, and it is time to let it all come gently to rest, and to let yourself come to rest along with it. So let your mind begin to release the details now, one by one, the way you release the cares of the day, as sleep draws near. Let the kings and the scholars and the fires and the dates blur softly together and drift away. You need hold on to none of it. Keep only the feeling of the place, the great library beside the sea, the endless shelves of scrolls, the calm morning light, the quiet devotion of the minds that gathered there so long ago. Let your thoughts go back, one last time, to where we began. To that soft early morning in the halls of the library, at the height of its glory. Stand there again now. In the hush, among the shelves. The cool air moves gently through the open arches. The light falls in long bars across the marble floor. Beyond the columns, the Mediterranean stretches away blue and bright and calm to the horizon, the same patient sea that has washed against that shore since long before there was any city there, and that washes against it still. All around you rise the scrolls, tens of thousands of them, the gathered thought of the world, and the only sounds are the soft ones, the whisper of papyrus, the scratch of a pen, the low murmur of a reader, the distant crying of the gulls. There is nowhere you need to be. There is nothing you need to do. There is only the quiet, and the light, and the sea, and the vast gentle presence of all that knowledge, gathered and cared for and loved. And as you stand there, in that vanished morning, let this be the gentle thought you carry down into sleep. The people who built this place, and the scholars who worked here, and the scribes who copied the scrolls, and the kings who dreamed the whole great dream, are all of them gone now. Every one, their names mostly forgotten, their lives long over. The library they made is gone. The city is half sunk beneath the sea. And yet what they did was not for nothing. They reached out with their minds and touched the truth of things. They measured the earth and mapped the stars. They gathered and preserved the beauty and the wisdom of their world. And though so much of it was lost, some of it survived, passed down through all the centuries, and reaches even to us, even to this quiet room, even to this moment. Their brief lives are woven into the long, unbroken story of human knowing. And so, in its own small way, is yours. The small anxieties that filled their days, that felt as heavy to them as ours feel to us, have passed away entirely, as though they had never been. But the light they tended, the knowledge they loved, the beauty they preserved, that remained, and remains still. And perhaps there is a comfort in that for you tonight, as you lie here in the dark. Perhaps the cares that press upon you now, that seem so large and so urgent in the small hours of the night, will one day soften and fade as gently as the great library itself faded, drawn away into the past, leaving behind only what truly mattered. Perhaps you can set them down, just for tonight, and trust the long, slow, patient turning of time to carry them where they need to go. There is nothing you must solve before you sleep. There is nothing you must remember, and nothing you must hold. The knowledge of the world was gathered and lost, and gathered again without your watching, and the great work of remembering goes on, held now in countless hands, needing nothing from you through the long quiet of this one night. You may lay your burdens down. You may rest, for you are one quiet mind among the countless minds that have loved to learn. One small keeper of the flame among the numberless keepers who have passed it, hand to hand, down all the long centuries. And that is not a lonely thought, but a gentle one. A thought that joins you to all of them, to the scholars in the morning light, and the scribes in their quiet rooms, and every soul who ever loved a book, or treasured a piece of knowledge, or wished to understand the world a little better. You belong to that great and gentle company. And tonight, your only task is to rest, and to let the long story of their labor, and their loss, and their enduring gift, carry you softly down toward sleep. So let your breathing slow now, and let it deepen. Let your body grow heavy and warm and still, sinking down into the quiet, the way a scroll settles onto its shelf at the end of the day. There is nothing more to do tonight. The long story is told. The question is answered, as well as it can ever be answered, not with a single fire, but with a slow and gentle fading, a soft farewell spread across the centuries. And there is peace in that answer, once we make our peace with it. The peace of understanding that all things rise and shine and fade in their turn. And that the fading is not the whole of the story, for what is loved and shared and passed on lives beyond it. Let the last images of the great library grow soft and dim now, and drift away into the dark. The endless shelves of scrolls, fading gently into shadow. The scholars at their tables, their work laid down. The halls growing quiet. The long bars of morning light, softening into the blue of evening. The bright sea beyond the columns, its restless shimmer stilling into calm. Let it all grow gentle and far away, a beautiful thing seen once, long ago, and now released. The way you release the day itself as you sink toward sleep. There is nothing left to hold. There is nothing left to fear. There is only the quiet, and the warmth, and the slow, soft tide of rest rising up to carry you away. The white city sleeps by its harbor, as it has slept through so many thousand nights. The sea washes gently against the shore, the same patient sea, murmuring the same old song it has always sung. The stars wheel slowly overhead, above the water, above the sunken palaces, above the place where the Great Library once stood, keeping their ancient watch as they have kept it since long before the first stone of Alexandria was ever laid, and as they will keep it long after we are gone. And you may rest now, as deeply and as peacefully as that vanished city rests beneath its stars and its sea, carried down gently into the dark and the quiet, and the rest that you have more than earned. Thank you for spending this quiet time with me here on Lanternlight Chronicles. If you are still awake, you may simply let these words fade and follow the story down into sleep whenever you are ready. And if ever you find yourself awake again on some other night, looking for something calm to carry you toward rest, I will be here, and there will be another long and gentle story waiting, another lost world or vanished wonder to wander through together in the dark. Until then, from the white city by the sea, and the quiet shelves, and the slow and patient stars, I wish you nothing but stillness, and comfort, and peace. Rest now. Let everything be quiet. And I wish you a calm and peaceful night.